let's begin. So this is a very personal subject for me. Not that I know it, not in my immediate family, my extended family. We're going to talk right now is the Aguna crisis, the Aguna issue in Orthodox Jewish policymaking. Um, Never clear how big of a crisis this was, but I'll explain. It was more than just, which is the principal issue, which is that according to traditional Jewish law, a woman requires a bill of divorce delivered by her husband in order to effect a get, a divorce. She cannot sue for a divorce on her own. Uh, Seldom is the case, actually, where, according to an ordinance, it's a kana of the Gaonim, the epic of rabbis that flourished after the sealing of the Talmud, is that a woman too could refuse a get and essentially make her husband an igun. Uh, Different limitations there, but certainly um, there is a really horrific situation in which a recalcitrant husband refuses to deliver a bill of divorce. And because of that, the woman, this chained woman, literally, aguna means chained, is stuck, cannot remarry. And we've seen just horrible cases. One organization that's really been the forefront of that is Aura. It's done a lot of good and a lot of support from our communities and our rabbinic leaders, which is critically important. Um, but the issue, as what I'm going to test here, is less about what's on the screen right now, but really about the ideological issue. Can Orthodox Judaism, can it come up with a solution on principle to solve an issue? And what's at stake more than just the very immediate issue of women in a very disastrous situation. That, of course, is first and foremost. But the ideological challenge. If Orthodox Judaism cannot halachically solve the Aguna crisis, then what good is it in the eyes of many people? And so that test of how can Orthodox Judaism respond to this major issue uh, became that in the long durée of the 20th century, became the test that would essentially be the imprimatur to show of Orthodox Judaism's viability in modern society in modern America. So how am I engaged with it personally? Followed Sir Lansley. This is an ad in the Daily Forward that appeared many, many times in 1921, 1922. So an advertisement went out. There is Weiss von Schönbrunn, sein Freu Sarziba. So there was this woman, unfortunately, who was from Plotsk. Her name was Tsaratsiba, and she's looking for her husband who has abandoned her in New York. And so an advertisement is taken out. This woman, Tsaratsiba, she wants a divorce, or she wants to know the whereabouts of her husband. If you know anything about the husband, the scoundrel of Tsaratsiba, I don't know much more about this case, go see BL, it's Benjamin Eleff, at 5006 Soto Court in Cleveland, Ohio. My great grandfather was the go-between. He was the agent of this forlorn, this deeply imperiled woman from Plotsk, who, not exactly clear, but likely wanted a bill of divorce so that she could go on with her life. So when I saw that uh, scan of this advertisement, it got me thinking about what that question of the different ways in which Orthodox Judaism has positioned itself to respond to the Aguna crisis. So first, in a periodical called the Jewish Center, not the Jewish Center in Manhattan, an appeal for justice. Note, the letters printed below are from a correspondence that actually took place, but for obvious reasons, the names of the writers are withheld. The editorial board of the Center is of the opinion that the issue raised by those letters is deserving of serious consideration. Dear Rabbi, my friend Mr. B told me that he went up to see you, and I should point out this. So this is 1922. Uh, Told me that he went up to see you with reference to performing a marriage ceremony for us. And although you could not see your way clear to officiate at my wedding just now, you were interested enough in my case to see what you could do for me. And I want to thank you for your kind interest. As Mr. B had explained my case to you, I shall not go into details. But if there is any more information that you need, kindly let me know, hoping that you will do everything in your power to make it possible for me to have a Jewish marriage ceremony. I am grateful, very truly yours, Mrs. X. The unknown rabbi responds and explains that this rabbi, actually not of who identified as a conservative rabbi in those times. Not exactly clear what the division sometimes was between this burgeoning conservative movement and orthodoxy in the first decades of the 20th century. We've talked about it before. Explains there's very little that I can do for you, madam. The reason is because you were previously married, and I cannot officiate a Jewish marriage when you're married to somebody else, even if that marriage has been from a practical point of view, all but dissolved. Solomon Zukro, who was a very early Talmudist and academic scholar of Talmud, who taught at Hebrew College in Boston. At the time was non-sectarian, now is a leading trans-denominational rabbinical program that's quite recent. In the 1920s, it was a major school for the training of Hebrew teachers and scholars. In some ways, where I happily serve as president, Gratz College was the partner college. What Gratz had envisioned itself here in Philadelphia, Boston Hebrew College was founded about 25 years later. Hebrew College envisioned itself in the 1920s. Probably worth talking more about the so-called Hebrew colleges that existed in Cleveland and Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston. It's been an interesting century for all the schools. Some of them, Baltimore and Cleveland, no longer exist. Boston has reimagined itself. Gratz has pretty much stayed true and is better for it. I am convinced, writes Zukro of Hebrew College, writing in a pretty fat tome, Adjustment of Law to Life in Rabbinics. On the right, I give you what the hardcover looks like. I am convinced that the future of Judaism lies in the hands of the modern Orthodox rabbi. He is the only man who can once again make of our religion a law of life, a living thing. Possessing a secular as well as a rabbinic education, he can appeal to both the old and the new generation. It is for this rabbi to set up a standard of Jewish religious observance for the present day. He must clearly discriminate between those laws and observances that are important for the spiritual welfare of our people, but which are no longer kept because of the indifference and ignorance of the Jewish masses, and those laws which we need no longer obey because they have become meaningless for us or are averse to our conception of life and the value of right and wrong. So this modern Orthodox rabbi is not a Rabbi Norman Lamb coined modern Orthodox rabbi. He is referring to the graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Yeshiva at the time, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary that we call Yeshiva University, called themselves strict Orthodox. Modern Orthodox was a euphemism for the seminary. The rabbi must make the people understand that Judaism is not merely composed of a few abstract dogmas, such as the unity of God and the brotherhood of man. That's a dig at reform leaders. But it seeks to influence the conduct of men and women at every point. Now, before I go to the slide, what Zukro is articulating here is after a chapter specifically about the Aguna crisis, and he cites That's how I found this in the first place. This Jewish Center article, he may even have been the author, for all we know, uh, that if the modern Orthodox rabbi, again, not exactly the modern Orthodox we think of today, but he uh, he will need to be able to figure out the Aguna crisis, not because there are so many Agunot, but theoretically this loomed large. Should point out that the Aguna crisis, although certainly it it reached a certain decibel for two reasons. Number one, there were many men, it always was the case, that migration to the United States from Central Europe and Eastern Europe in the 19th and then in the 20th centuries, um, it was very expensive. It cost the equivalent of $10,000 today. So this idea that the people who came to the United States were poor, yeah, they were poor after they bought their ticket, but it was actually a middle class thing to do throughout that time. Very expensive to travel. A sailboat took 3 weeks to travel across the Atlantic. Eventually, with steam, it took 6 days. That's very often folks who couldn't afford it stopped off in England and they would peddle oranges for 6 months to earn the rest of the money needed to get across the Atlantic. In any case, because it was so expensive, very often for young families, the man, the husband, would would try first, and he would try to earn a living, and he would send a half, two-thirds, whatever he could muster of his income back to his family to retrieve it. Sometimes these men would turn into scoundrels and they would just leave their families behind. They would start a new life, hence the slide that I began with. That was one reason for the Aguna crisis taking on sort of elevated visibility. The other one was World War One. We had massive casualties and deaths, and there was a lot of concern. If you could not identify, could not know for certain that a soldier died in battle, a Jewish one, uh, how can we essentially release his wife as a widow? And so a lot of the thinking, a lot of the halachic literature comes out specifically in response to World War One. So the first one to have a solution of significance was Rabbi Louis Epstein, also interestingly of Boston, what's Kilat Israel, KI, driving on Harvard Street. You know it very well. It's this huge structure that they've actually just added to in the last couple of years. He authors a book, The Jewish Marriage Contract, a study of the status of the woman in Jewish law, of the woman in Jewish law. Likely would be titled something different if it were produced today. Um, and this is a follow up from a responsum from a tshuva that he would submit to the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly, the Halachic Advisory Committee for the conservative movement and their rabbinical arm. And here's a little background of what he says. I suggested in my monograph a solution to the Aguna problem in the proceedings of the Rabbinical Assembly. So at their annual convention, Louis Epstein, who is a very traditional rabbi, was trained in Orthodox institutions as well as the seminary, which I published at the request of the Rabbinical Assembly in 1930. The wife herself be given the authority under rabbinic supervision to write her own divorce in the capacity of agent to her husband. I had a solution, he writes in 1930, so you can see that this is very much a live issue in the first decades of the 20th century. That very cleverly that the wife become by the time of the marriage, the husband says to his bride, "You become my agent. You represent my thinking. Should I ever become a scoundrel?" Under rabbinic supervision, so endorsed by the Rabbinical Assembly, to write her own divorce in the capacity of agent to her husband, that witnesses be named by the group verbally and by means of an autographed instrument, and that by such a manipulation of several legal principles, so Kedushin al Tanai is conditional marriage, the authorization for the writing of the divorce would be legally valid. I sent my monograph. So he's reflecting on this incident. I sent my monograph, so about between 10 and 20 pages, my monograph to close to 1,000 rabbis over the world. It was ignored by most of them, and those who did answer said that while they found no serious objection to my proposal, meaning on the technical halachic aspects, they thought he was on solid ground. Said that while they found no serious objection to my proposal, basis of law, it could not be considered until approved by the leading scholars in Israel or until a Sanhedrin of such scholars be assembled. So the responses he claims that he received was that it is a smart idea, but in order for us to be so courageous, we need to have a large swath of leading rabbinical authorities endorse it. That's not exactly true. And about 120 rabbis wrote short missives of their objection to Epstein in a little Hebrew tract that you can find online. But certainly the idea, and even in those, the idea was that this is not how Orthodox Judaism responds to the Aguna crisis. So how did they respond? So the United Synagogue Review, which is the congregational body of the conservative movement, so an article appears, conservative movement to inaugurate national Beit Din, cooperation of other rabbinic bodies invited. They were invited, they didn't come in the end. There was talk of the Rabbinic Council of America joining forces, but eventually, under the leadership of Rabbi Soloveitchik, they declined. Jewish laymen should know that a historic event in the life of American Jewry, so now we're fast forwarding to 1953. So this is the improved solution for the conservative rabbinate on Epstein in the 1930s. This is what's called the Lieberman Takana. So people should know. Remember, this is a periodical designed for congregational leaders, lay leaders. Jewish laymen should know that a historic event in the life of American Jewry was launched at the last convention of the Rabbinical Assembly of America held in Atlantic City last June. It approved the compact between the faculty of the Jewish Thought Assembly of America and the Rabbinical Assembly. So the Rabbinical School and the Rabbinical Organization were in concert in their opinion, whereby it is hoped to preserve the integrity and advance the welfare of the Jewish family in accordance with Jewish law and tradition, and further the dynamic process inherent in the Jewish tradition. So what was this? Saul Lieberman was the leader, was the rector of the rabbinical program at JTS, and his solution, which Professor Mark Shapiro, who of course is a fixture in Torah Motion programs, he's written a small book called Lieberman and the Orthodox. He's probably lectured on this issue very particularly, is that Lieberman, who was a graduate of the Slobodka Yeshiva, was a very, in private maybe, respected Talmudist and Talmud Chacham. This is the moment in which publicly Orthodox leadership of the United States felt the need, on the whole, to distance themselves from Lieberman. Lieberman was very impassioned on this issue, and although I am oversimplifying to some degree, his solution was to embed in the ketubah, in the marriage document of a man and a woman under the aegis of the conservative movement, to allow not the wife to serve as an agent, but to allow the rabbinical assembly to have the best interest of the husband in mind, that should he turn into a scoundrel, that they will effectuate the divorce or absolve the marriage altogether. That is the gist of the Lieberman Takana. The Orthodox didn't like it. Rabbi Fabian Schoenfeld of Kew Garden Hills, of Young Israel, and a very important organization man in his time. They passed away a small number of years ago. It has always been the policy of the conservative leadership. This is published in the Young Israel Viewpoint a few months after the Lieberman Takana was publicized. It has always been the policy of the conservative leadership to guard their pronouncements in a cloak of traditional quarters. They always try to be firm. The public announcement of their intention to create this Beit Din is another perfect example of this clever but dishonest strategy. So you see, these are fighting words. The wording and phrasing of the text, which informs us of the proposed establishment of the Beit Din, again, the Beit Din that will oversee the Takana, the Lieberman Takana, is such that on the surface, there is little that could be subjected to severe criticism. It all seems Talmudically accurate. Were this text placed in front of the average Jewish layman without any indication as to its origins, he would have possessed a very suspicious character to discover a conservative background. So regular Joe reads this article, reads the Hebrew, reads it in English in translation. It looks very orthodox. But beneath this carefully and correctly phrased statement lies spiritual malice, which intends to break the ageless chain of Torah tradition, which alone has preserved the welfare of the Jewish family. That's key, and I'll return to that in a second. Which alone has made the Jewish household the impregnable stronghold of Jewish history. It is at this fortress of our people that the poison of conservative ideology, again, his words, not mine, is now directed. The fact that this act may be the result of rather of ignorance than of malice, of forethought, does nothing to mitigate this ill-intentioned deed. And a very good scholar, Professor Benjamin Steiner, has written about it in a past issue of the American Jewish Archives. Lieberman was simultaneously eager to solve the Aguna crisis, which again represented the bona fides of how a traditional community, for him it was the conservative movement, can appropriately respond to a modern question. I can't stress that enough. The Aguna crisis, the plight of the chained woman, obviously was paramount, but wrapped into this was the need to demonstrate the relevance of traditional Judaism in modern life. The Aguna crisis represented that. Whereas in the 1920s, 1930s, and even before then, it stemmed from immigration and even casualties of World War I. Lieberman noticed something else, which was that more often than ever before, he was greeting people who were divorced. Divorce in the United States spikes truly in the 60s, but already it was very detectable in the 50s. And therefore, what he wanted to do was to protect the nuclear family. He thought, and so did other members of the Rabbinical Assembly, that if he could convince more people to buy in to the conservative Jewish marriage contract, that if they would seek a rabbi for counseling and they had this instrument to protect the welfare of the bride, again, in the contingency that her husband turns into a scoundrel, more and more American Jews will live a religious life and in counsel of rabbis. That was his solution, both to the Aguna crisis, as well as how to stave off what he considered to be this contagion of divorce spreading throughout the United States. Again, his ideas, I'm just here reporting the news decades later. Rabbi Schoenfeld understood that. And he said, basically, lo zu haderech, this is not the way. We do not, he thought, create changes in the marriage contract. That was sacrosanct. That was the idea that we had to preserve the traditional marriage without any sort of takana, without any addition. Don't augment it one bit. And that's the way to protect the Jewish family, which alone has preserved the welfare of the Jewish family. He understood exactly what the Rabbinical Assembly was getting at. So now finally, Orthodox Judaism is feeling the need to come up with some sort of solution. Here pictured from Fifth Avenue Synagogue, rather, is Rabbi Emanuel Rackman, who's already at the was in Far Rockaway before then, and a leading figure, a public intellectual, one of the leaders at Yeshiva University, which we'll get to in a little bit. And he writes, he actually was part of a presentation to the Rabbinical Council of America, that Orthodox rabbinical group, in 1973. And he has a presentation and a petition. The major problems, states Rabbi Rachman, um, the major problems of the halacha today are created as much by its supporters as by its resistors. The halachists are keeping the halacha frozen, and I cannot be content with the freeze. We cannot ask people forever to be patient, and I don't fight to solve the aguna problem or the problem of illegitimacy because I want to silence opposition to the halacha. I fight for solutions because, as an Orthodox Jew, I want the halacha to cause no agony to any human being. Halacha must have a solution. I am fighting because of my own conscience and my own empathy with suffering fellow Jews. The freeze has been tragic, and we must confess our sin. The fact that there are many great rabbis who are frightened by the thought of solutions that may divide the Jewish community. Again, referring to the Lieberman Tikkun, although he has a different solution that's brought about first by Eliezer Berkovitz of the Hebrew Theological College in Chicago. The fact that there were so many great rabbis who are frightened by the thought of solutions that may divide the Jewish community is no answer. The Talmud tells us that the destruction of the temple came about because one rabbi didn't have the guts in the year 70 to do what she should have done. Talking about the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa incident in Masachet Gittin. No, it's not talking about that. And Orthodoxy now bears the burden of doing some very constructive things. So he would champion this throughout the early 70s, and it would come to a head in the mid 70s, 1975. He worked alongside Eliezer Berkovitz, professor of philosophy, who at, again, what's now known as the Skokie Yeshiva. The Berkovitz episode deserves its own discussion. And I think, again, Professor Mark Shapiro has found all of the critical texts for this. It's related to because Mark's one of all of his books are great. One of the best of his great books is his biography of the Sfirei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, and he too, at the end of his life, he dies in the mid 60s, wants to solve the Aguna crisis. He's positioned to solve it by a number of people. Rabbi Leo Young of the Jewish Center gets involved, and he tells them, "I'm too old to handle the issue." But one of my leading disciples, Eliezer Berkovitz, he's particularly apt and worthy to solve it. Why don't you go to him? Berkovitz does. He cites the example of Pruzbul of Hillel of solving some economic burden of lending money as an example of how Orthodox Judaism and Halacha updates itself. Suffice to say that Berkovitz is burned horribly by the issue. Menachem Kasher gets involved. It's a really sordid affair. He is really, is Berkovitz, he taps out. He is very upset. He actually, soon after, it's one of the reasons why I think, I haven't seen it, I can't prove it, but I think he makes Aliyah and he retires. He thinks that he'll have a better chance of feeling heard in Israel. Very important figure. And the baton, therefore, is handed over to Rabbi Rachman. Rachman continues, what are the arenas in which something must be done? And if we go to the bolded section over here, there have always been Jews who didn't want to take advantage of heterim, of leniencies. And they can continue to refuse to take advantage of them. And he's suggesting Kedushin al Tanai, something similar, or what's interpreted as similar to the Lieberman Takana. Even in Tanaitic times, not all Jews accepted the heterim that were given. One reason for optimism in this connection is the Orthodox women themselves are now beginning to clamor for action. So now their women are seeking agency from themselves. And this is a very hopeful sign on the horizon. Rabbi Rachman wrote about this many times over. The singular figure that brings the Rachman formulation down, which again is the halachic intricacies are not my issue right now. We'll call his theory the conditional marriage, that you allow the woman or a beit din at the time of marriage to do what's in the best interest of the husband, and the marriage, therefore itself, can be dissolved because the husband is no longer working in the best interest of himself once he is transformed into a scoundrel and refuses to deliver a divorce to his wife. Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was a very even-keeled person usually, although there are times in which he was vociferous in his criticisms publicly. In the mid-1970s, when he's truly at the height of his powers, he delivers a lecture at a convening, semi-annual convening of the RCA. And he states the following: I have to discharge a duty. Believe me, I do it with sadness in my heart. You know me, because they're all students. I never criticize anybody. I've never attacked anybody. I've never set myself up as a judge or arbiter who approves or disapproves of statements made by people. But today, kulo kol hakitzin, I feel it is my duty to make the following statement. Do you expect to survive as Orthodox rabbis? Do you expect to carry on the Masorah, the tradition, under such circumstance, referring to the vote which failed to adopt Rachman's proposal to solve the Aguna crisis? Chaos will replace the Torah. I hope those gathered here will join me in objecting to such discussion and debates at the Rabbinical Convention. I cannot imagine a Republican National Convention or a Democrat National Convention where a symposium would be held as to whether communism should replace democracy in the United States. He's writing about this in the 70s, right, during the peak of the Cold War. To speak about changing halachos of Chazal is at least as nonsensical as discussing communism at a Republican National Convention. It is discussing methods of self-destruction and suicide. Rabbi Rachman mentions that women are getting involved. Likely, he would have in mind a few years later, Blue Greenberg, who writes a book on women in Judaism, A View from Tradition, which he dedicates an entire chapter to the Aguna crisis. This book really launched Greenberg's career as a public figure and as a noted Orthodox Jewish feminist. She always struggled, I think it's fair to say, about Orthodox Jewish feminism. Many of the leading feminists, Jewish or otherwise, internally for American Judaism, were Jewish by birth. And so starting really in the late 1960s. And so many sort of downplayed Greenberg's advocacy because they thought that Orthodox Judaism was not to be saved, and therefore, could you really be a feminist and still be Orthodox? Were many of her questions, and so Greenberg really took it from both sides, both in terms of her colleagues on the left in the liberal feminist movement, but also certainly her peers in Orthodox Judaism. I think that her book actually gets reviewed twice in the magazine, in the journal Tradition, twice, both negatively. You rarely see two reviews coming out. Let us apply the theoretical structure to specific situations. Given the unmistakable pattern toward equalization in Jewish divorce law, that is, the gradual limitation of the male's absolute right and the gradual expansion of protections for women, the rabbis of today can no longer plead an inability to rectify the iniquity. To say that their hands are tied or that they can resolve an individual case but cannot find a comprehensive solution is to admit they are unworthy of the authority vested in them. This is a phrase that she coins. People have said it many times over, whether they're quoting her or they realize it or not.
Well, there's a halachic way.
Worse, it bespeaks a lack of rabbinic will to find a halachic way. It says, if you really were serious about it, you'd find a solution, Orthodox rabbis. She quotes C.C. Berkovitz and Rachman. She very much identifies as part of that group. So let's get into some of the solutions. Number one is the passing of the landmark so-called Get Bill, Remember, divorce is legislated on a state level, not on a federal level. So New York, which is a high concentration of Orthodox Jews in the 1980s, and this was really the politicking of the Agudas Israel, the Agudath Israel, and Moshe Sher, their longtime executive, passed a law that the courts refuse to get involved in a divorce unless they can see that a religious divorce was executed. Um, the questions of how well it's been upheld. I'm told by experts that it's been upheld. For the most part, it's been revised on several occasions, at least one other occasion. Um, and so for New York, did much to solve the issue, not through a halachic uh, intervention, but making sure that if the husband would like to actually get a civil divorce, there needs to be a religious divorce that precedes it. Meanwhile, the RCA is trying in the 1980s to come up with a solution to that would somehow both would somehow toe the line between addressing a modern challenge while also appearing not too much of an innovation. As quietly as they introduced it, an article appears in the Jewish World in 1984, a very important newspaper in its time that comes out of Queens and the Five Towns. As quietly as they introduced it, official of the Rabbinical Council of America last summer called the Orthodox rabbis to suspend use of the prenuptial agreement they developed to alleviate the plight of the aguna or anchored woman. The prenuptial agreement, which was 4 years in the making, was issued by the Orthodox Rabbinical Group just a year ago. At the time, it was meant as a major move to prevent the problem of women who are divorced under civil law but whose husbands refuse to give them a get or religious bill of divorce. Last December, so this is December 1983, the RCA, which is the largest association of Orthodox rabbis in the United States, introduced a prenuptial contract, meant to address the problem, designed and it was done by rabbis in Los Angeles, particularly as a secular document, as Abner Weiss designed as a secular document to be signed by a couple before their marriage. It was meant to be it'd be enforceable in civil courts and ensure that a get followed a civil divorce. Continuing on, according to several sources involved with developing the contract, its wording had the support of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the preeminent scholar of Jewish law. Problem was that Rabbi Soloveitchik was getting very old at this time, and it wasn't clear how people were using his name. The contract obliges the bridegroom to issue his spouse a get in the event of their future divorce. The woman, too, is obligated to accept the get under the contract. Under the agreement, the RCA Beit Din, religious court, can impose a charge of $250. Today, if you today it'd be about $600 per day in liquidated damages on either spouse refusing to comply. A somewhat similar document used by the conservative movement and contained in the Ketubah marriage contract itself was legally enforceable as a contract last year by the New York State Court of Appeals. But last June 28th, in a brief letter sent by its members, the RCA requested that all Orthodox rabbis suspend use of its document until further notice. The letter stated that technical problems had developed which could affect its legal acceptability. So the problem that they found, and this essentially introduces the idea not of an intervention in the marriage contract, not in the ketubah like Lieberman, not in the marriage ceremony like Rackman, but a separate document now known as the RCA prenup. My wife and I signed one. Not exactly a romantic document, but then again, neither is the ketubah if you actually read it. It can be made very pretty, but it's still not a romantic document. The challenge to this was posed principally by Rabbi J. David Bleich, that this was an issue of a smachta, that you're charging far too much money in their judgment, about $600 a day in damages for every day that the husband does not deliver the formal get. That's what is done with the prenuptial agreement, that because it's way too steep, that nobody could possibly afford it, that it was no good. It was not a realistic contract. But meanwhile, uh, the issue is getting quite heated here in the journal. It wasn't a monthly; it came out a number of times a year by this time, called Hamavaser, that had articles by young men from Yeshiva College and young women from Stern College for Women, so the undergraduate programs at Yeshiva University, dedicating an entire issue or a huge segment of one issue on social action. No easy way. The continuing plight. Um, uh, out of no easy way out, excuse me, the continuing plight of Agunot, and then talking about a story of an Aguna, Naomi Oberstein, a case history. And then you see over here this whole advertisement about a fellow who refused to give his wife a get. So more and more young people, more and more women are challenging the Orthodox rabbinate to come up with a solution by the late 1980s. More from the 1984 case. Here, Rabbi J. David Bleich noted the RCA document promises. So this is what I was saying about the asmachta. The objection has been raised by others, such as Rabbi Judah Dick of Brooklyn, a former member of the commission, who has since resigned. Both he and Bleich have framed their own proposals. So again, people are motivated. They don't want to hold things back. There needs to be a solution, they all claim. Rabbi Moshe Steinberg has strongly opposed the prenuptial agreement in a meeting with Rabbi Soloveitchik last spring. Again, attempts to reach Rabbi Soloveitchik, though, were unsuccessful. People were saying a lot of things in Rabbi Soloveitchik's name. It wasn't clear the veracity of these things. So finally, this is sort of the happy conclusion. So I was referring to what's now known as the RCA prenup. Many of my rabbinical colleagues, this is an article published in the RCA magazine, Rabbinics Today, in December 1993. Many of my rabbinic colleagues have told me that this is Rabbi Saul Berman, excuse me. Many of my rabbinic colleagues have told me that they are reluctant to use a prenuptial agreement related to assurance of issuance of a get upon dissolution. He's a lawyer after all, of the marriage by civil divorce. I'm deeply dismayed by the reluctance, albeit I have some understanding of why such resistance exists. And he reviews some of the psychology that we've been talking about for the last hour or so. In time, the RCA prenup is approved, and it's authored by Rabbi Mordechai Willig. It receives approbation, like we saw from the Epstein case from the 1930s, that it needed to receive wide agreements from Rabbi Yosef. Other rabbinical leaders stand behind it. It becomes very important that politicking is just, and they learned that for the last 80 so years of the history of halacha, is that so much about it is the sociology behind it, of getting the approval of other people. They modifications essentially to the issue of asmachta to make sure that the penalty is within reason is the ultimate solution, with other refinements as well. But what's happened today is that the RCA prenup has become the sort of the solution, because it is not intervention in the traditional marriage contract and the ketubah. It does not take place, although many of it times it is signed at a wedding. It need not be. In fact, there's a whole campaign of post-ups. People who did not sign it at their wedding can go ahead and you can download the agreement online. You can sign it afterwards, and there's a whole campaign by Ora and by the Rabbinical Council of America and the Beit Din of America to push this. This becomes the most elegant solution, where the RCA creates a document. It may be the most of all the wonderful things that have been created out of these organizations. This is probably the most impactful, not just because the RCA prenup, I think to date, has not been successfully challenged in court, meaning it has stood as an impediment to stop these scoundrel husbands, but also because it demonstrates the Orthodox rabbinate's capacity to be both committed fully to their interpretation of Jewish law, but also answer the contemporary moment. And for 100 years, that was understood. The case study was the crisis of the aguna. Okay. So there's some comments in the chat, but Shelley, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to know, though, we have the principle that you're not supposed to go to civil authorities, that you're supposed to go to stuff like Beit Din. So I'm very much in favor of this because it gets rid of the problem, but aren't we forcing non-Jews to get rid of the problem, or the secular government that we don't want to deal with in a lot of other cases?
Right. So it's a good question. Well, point of fact is that in order to dissolve your marriage in the States, you need to apply for a divorce. We're talking about the New York get law. Eventually, you needed to go to civil law to get a divorce, and in all those places. And so you need to incorporate it. The issue of our code is what you're speaking about, which is Jewish law presumes better to handle your stuff in the community than outside of it. It, in some sense, it's unavoidable though, because of the financial implication, divorce, and because of the state on the state level, their authority to create and dissolve marriage and divorce, essentially, are all registered state by state. A couple is going to need to encounter the courts on there. So on this, I think there's a separate issue. It's interesting is that a friend of mine, Geraldine Gudufin, actually wrote a dissertation at Brandeis on comparing state oversight of Jewish marriage and divorce, doing a comparative history of France and the United States, and the two places couldn't be further apart. That just shows the level of oversight. It's a good question.
I don't know if somebody. I had two related questions, and maybe the answer is this another session. First thing is the Israelis had a very different solution, and that's now become a bit complicated, which is locking up the husband in jail until he would give the get, and then, then clearly a number of people don't accept the idea of a prenuptial agreement, and that's why there's still refusers who have demonstrations in front of the house. And finally, of course, you're not dealing with the classic problems of the aguna, as you said. I mean, the classic problem is either they're dead, but we can't prove it.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. The history of aguna, which is it's found all over Shas, but in Yevamot, is about what do you do? This chained woman, we don't know the whereabouts, and that's why World War I is very much a corollary of that. You're absolutely right. Yeah, and please, you're absolutely right to qualify my remarks. Is that by no means do I want to accept the ubiquity of the acceptance of the RCA prenup. There are many people who still feel it being a problem, whether anthropologically or halachically. You're absolutely right. But in terms of Orthodox Judaism coming up with some solution of some widespread measure, this and that in that 100-year history has been the most successful, was my point. In the chat, yes, Blue Greenberg is alive and well, and she's had a remarkable career. Her archives are at Radcliffe. I've used them from time to time on, and her husband, Yitz Greenberg's, are at Harvard, at Widener. They saved everything. It's a fascinating material. Susanna.
Yeah, I just wanted to relate a Ma'aseh Shehaya. A roommate of mine from college got married. I think this must have been in the late 70s. The marriage lasted about 3 weeks. She spent 2 years getting a get. The RCA was dragging its feet and didn't give her any help until she threatened to go to the RA.
Interesting. Two comments, one privately to me. Jay, Rabbi Kalman points out the penalty. Yes, the penalty is less severe now, which is one of the solutions. It's not a $600 penalty. And so that's one of the reasons why they obviated the issue of asmachta. Our world-class demographer and census and poll taker and interpreter, Mark Trencher, points out that, and I mean, Mark, what you do is amazing. That it's about socializing this. This is not an advocacy lecture, but self-identified modern Orthodox Jews at 63%, 11. Of course, Mark and everybody else should know well is that the number, according to Pew, the number of self-identified modern Orthodox Jews represent 30% of the total Orthodox population. To put that in perspective, there are more Jews living in Lakewood than self-identified more modern Orthodox Jews throughout the United States. So when Eli Siener, head of school at Frisch, says that he's educating something like 15% of the modern Orthodox population, he's actually being very serious. So that number, though, 11%, is very, very troubling.
Zev, if I don't know, I mean, I came late, a pleasure to be here. And normally I'm teaching at this time, so I haven't been able to come, as you know. But I don't know if you told everybody you had a baby girl last night. Your wife had a baby girl.
I did at the very beginning.
Okay,
I
so I
didn't
want
have
to
it.
wish
My
you
wife
Mazel Tov,
did.
but I want to wish you Mazel Tov. I want to thank you for the whole series. Wish you Mazel Tov, and I do have to leave actually in 1 minute. But anyway, so I figured I'd throw that in against the iPad. If any other questions you can take, and thank you. And we'll let him go. Please let him go in 2 minutes. He was up very late last night, and I think it's a great
I'm on a high. I'm on a
testament to his dedication that he's giving a shir basically 12 hours after becoming a father again. So that's want to thank you for that and for all your classes. Okay, and Mazel Tov, we should have many smachot in the Jewish people. Thank you.
Okay. All right, maybe we'll take 2 more questions per Jay's. He's been a father longer than I and a husband longer than I, so it's good guidance. I'll get to Lincoln shortly. Somebody has a hand up. They're only identified as iPad.
Okay, that's me. So this solution provides a get, right? Not an annulment, it's a get.
The solution of the RCA doesn't provide a get. It tries to encourage a get because of these of the prenuptial. The only resolution.
This prenup.
Correct.
So my question would go, assuming that the get becomes an enforceable thing and people use it, has there been a new look by the groom at the ketubah itself? Because if you're giving a gate, you have to pay out the ketubah, and when you're enumerating it in camels and goats and bars of gold, which are difficult to do, if it's an enforceable agreement, is there a movement to try and create the gates in more modern kind of monetary devices? You know, dollars. Gold wafers, but not camels and goats and all the rest of it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think that because the ketubah rather, one of the earliest versions we have is from the Rif, lived around the year 1000, and that thereby it makes it one of the more ancient full documents. Although the people dispute certain aspects of it, and there've been some changes. Every leading rabbinic figure has their own preference for it for a ketubah, but because it's so ancient, we keep to it. And there's also a whole one could add. Rambam Maimonides has a particular severity about preserving the ketubah. Calls it a doraisa.
But he assumed a different society than we do when 80% are involved in agriculture versus 3 or 4% today. It's a whole different ballgame.
Correct. And I think that we keep them. The ketubah does not really serve as the prenuptial agreement anymore so much as it actually affects the actual marriage. And therefore it's almost a ritual rather than a formal contract. But to your specific point, I'm not aware of any serious movement to update the currency.
Okay, fair enough.
I just don't know.
The other question, which I'd like a personal comment on, but you don't have to, is when you started to say that the aguna issue is a question of does orthodoxy respond to modern conditions? do you have any feelings about how Orthodoxy does respond to modernity and its issues? Because I think that is the question for modern times.
That's a really good question, right? So you're asking the Jewish leader in me to step away from history as a protection and offer my actual opinion. Nobody's ever asked me to do that, but I've usually gotten away with talking about the past. I it's interesting. I have to think about it some more. My feeling is that so you're taking away my historian's cap and putting on my rabbinical one. I like to believe that the Torah has answers for all of our challenges. I believe in its evergreen capacity to protect us and to move us, and that there are solutions. How in this particular issue or others, we're also sensitive to the fact that religion, for better or for worse, involves people, not just God. And it's much easier to reckon with God than people, which is, now that you've asked me for my answer, I found that I could be very good at sidestepping it. All right,
Like
everybody.
a politician.
Yeah, well, I am that sometimes. Anyway, everybody, so I'm going, this is great. Appreciate this very sensitive issue and sort of looking back about these sources, which I don't think most people have found. And there's more, as you see in the chat. We can talk about Rabbi Simcha Krauss and others the late Rabbi Simcha Krauss, and trying to find a resolution. So there's more to say on it. Thank goodness. More to learn and more to study and more to talk about. Everybody, next week, same bad time, same bad channel. We'll find out what I'm talking about. Anyway, see you then. Bye-bye.
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.
Thank you. Thank you.